Okay, this sixth video is going to be titled My Situation. Now, so far we've gone through um, the big business to destroy you, which are the RipOffReport.com and scam sites, how not to be a victim, how we need regulation, and then how we, the people, must stand up and fight. And then my last video was titled Time to Meet, Time to Act. Well, as I was thinking about that and setting up the GoFundMe account, I thought, well, you know, if people go through all this, I'm being a little cryptic in what happened to me. But if they want to know what led me to this point, I'm going to give you an example of how my situation could be regulated so that it doesn't happen. But again, this is just mine, and there's others that have different type of situations, and that's why it's important that we get the situations down to create themes of regulation behind them. So in my case, it's kind of easy to figure out. I mean, if you Google my name, you see the RipOff Report listing at the very top, and then you go down maybe 3 or 4 places on the Google page, and you'll see a lawsuit. And it's kind of funny that that's right there. So if anyone wants to see how coincidental it is that RipOffReport.com gets a higher ranking than the federal courts, they do. So my background is accounting, and as I said in a previous video, I've gone through the corporate side. I've also gone through public accounting firms, and then ultimately creating a consulting practice, and prior to that working for consulting practices. The important thing is how my profession is just ripe for these types of RipOffReport.coms. So as a consultant, what are you asked to do? Well, typically a lot of organizations will use us either if there's something that's too technical for their internal staff, and so they just kind of need a just-in-time consultant to come in, figure it out, implement it, and then move on. In other cases, it's where the executive management doesn't have the ability to determine if staff are capable of the job functions, and so they'll utilize us for something like that. And then there's also cases where the management just doesn't want to be the bad guy or bad gal, and so they call us in and can kind of blame us for the pending termination of an employee. You know, we're the ones that recommended it. Well, mine is a hybrid of all three. I was doing work for this organization for about 8-9 years, and originally I was called in by executive management that was not around, by the way, at the time of my termination. It was a new group that was in at that time. But the first team of executive management basically asked me to look at everything and come up with a series of recommendations. And so I did. Over a 2-month period, I did a significant amount of due diligence, and I wrote a report that basically advised them how to reorganize the entire organization. At that early date, I had pointed to quite a few employees and said it's not possible that many of these recommendations can be implemented with these types of employees. But this organization has been known for hiring people that they're friendly with rather than people that have the competency or capabilities. So that was one of the struggles at the very beginning. So being a consultant, you basically provide advice. If the client wants it implemented, that's another engagement. They ask you to implement it, and you do it. You're not really taking a position as an officer would, because you know their neck is on the line. It's more geared by the client, and it just so happens I started to implement everything over a series of years, but it was one of those engagements that I would do work for maybe 2 to 3 months, move on, hand it to the existing staff, and then get a call back maybe 6 months to a year later and say, I think we need you back. Sure enough, I go back in. It seemed like every time I did this, everything I put together, they found a way to take down. And that is pretty much, that's not just specific to this organization. I've seen that in other organizations. They do not have the capability to maintain a system that's above their head. So it's easier to just disregard it, disband it, or destroy it. So over the years, that's what was going on. It was almost a joke. I mean, it was they had no problem calling me back every time, and I'd just go back and fix it. And based on if there was newer technology or some newer methodologies came up, I would implement them. But over this period, I literally transformed them into a very good organization, very responsible. However, prior to the last return, I wasn't keeping track of the enemies I was making inside. And this real scary thing about consulting is once somebody is incapable, they have this fear that they'll never ever be able to work again. They'll do anything to destroy you or get you out of the way. And a couple of them were doing that. They were trying to find something they could take me down with so I'd never return. One of the professionals there was actually a lawyer, very incompetent. Actually started with the organization out of law school, and so he couldn't help it, but he just didn't really have any real world experience, and he was very nervous about being terminated. And prior to the final time I came back, they had decided to terminate him, and I think he held a grudge against me that for pointing at him for years. There are also some other financial accountants that I don't know how they got their degree. It must have been online because they just didn't have basic understanding of much. And so it didn't take long before, I've got quite a few enemies. Well, prior to leaving, and that would have been my last time, I actually told the executive manager, I can't really do any more for you unless you decide you're going to start over and start with a whole new team. And so lo and behold, they did, and there was close to 6 terminations. And that's why with this RipOff report, the first problem I had was to try to figure out which of these 6, or maybe all 6, got together, or how they were given the information that they put out there. So there's this cooperation between the organization and these terminated employees. But back to the point, and that is I was ready to leave a final time and really did not want to do much more consulting for them. So they had asked me if I would actually come in as their CFO and their chief operating officer, which is very unusual. But due to the amount of time I had with this organization and the amount of work, I was probably one of the few that knew everything about the organization. And the new executive management wasn't in long enough, and they just didn't have the capability. Now, when it entered the employment part, when I was to be now an officer, a CFO and a chief operating officer, I had executed an employment agreement with them. And it basically, as most employment agreements have, they have a 1-year stipulation that for whatever reason you are terminated, whatever remaining time is left on your contract is considered a severance and they have to pay it. One of the reasons I put that in was because I knew now as an officer it would be much different than me as a consultant. I would be dealing in a lot of other areas that would get very sensitive, and I would have to take a certain position that they may not be willing to go along with because they just didn't understand things like arm's length. They had no concept of conflicts of interest and those kind of things. So we did execute an agreement. Within the first 6 months, it was self-evident that the things that I needed to do as the CFO, they would not go along with. So it got to the boiling point, and I decided to put together a letter to the chairman of the board outlining 4 or 5 major areas. I mean, these are significant areas, not pettiness, but and I won't want to go into it. If you want to see it, it's on the face of that lawsuit that's still listed on the internet. Now, what typically is supposed to happen in that regard is if an officer ever goes to the board of directors, or let's say an audit committee or any oversight group, there is always a protection there. It's almost like a whistleblower's protection, and this is what really started the whole problem. Now, other professionals may disagree with me, but if I had to do it all over again, as a CFO, would I have written that letter to the board of directors and basically been a whistleblower? After what I'm going through right now, not in a million years. So I know that's not the right thing to say to young CFOs, but as a mature CFO, it destroyed my life. So I'd recommend in the future, if you find information you feel is reportable, put it in a file, hand it to the HR department, and just have them document it. Because going forward, if I not sent that letter, I would have had a pretty easy life right now instead of this disaster. So let me wrap this up. The net was this. After I had filed a lawsuit to collect my severance, lo and behold, a lot of personal information showed up on the internet through RipOffReport.com. Allegedly, we heard from the defendant's legal counsel that it must have been the terminated employees who had a vendetta. I personally feel that the way they obtained that information was a backup drive that was in my office. When I was not there at the time of termination, I think it was confiscated and all the data was taken off of it, because the information that showed up on the internet could have only come from, or certain parts of it could have only come from my backup drive. Compensation information, projects I was involved in the past that were never made public. So this is why this is even more compelling. In my situation, what I'd like to see happen with regulation is if there is an active legal case going on, someone cannot use the public forum to replace deposition and discovery. This is really important. If it's handled that way, why even file a lawsuit? Because you can get destroyed in the public financially, and your reputation's destroyed, and nothing matters. So let's go through this final part, and that'll be the end of it. So when you publish information, if you're out to destroy someone, what you do is you mix truth with lies or truth with slander. And that's what they did with me. They took real life situations I was in, projects, countries, industries, and they would twist it to make me look like a fraud. And mostly because they were out to enact revenge. It's clear. I mean, if you read it, this sounds like just ranting and raving. It actually sounds like it belongs on Facebook. You know, and if it went onto Facebook, I probably wouldn't have any problem with it. But when they go through RipOffReport.com, it's a whole different level of slander. So this is the problem with the unregulated act, that if a website can be wide open like this, and if there's an active legal case going on and people want to stay outside the court system, they can do whatever they want and they can say whatever they want. And I said this way early in our video series, but I got to bring it home. This is where this needs to be regulated. And this is where this kind of slander needs to stop. So if you can't get it off of RipOffReport.com, now it's even more damaging because if I looked at a regulation that should have been in place to protect me, it would have said that once we discovered this information was on the internet, and so it wouldn't cause me any financial harm, and since I was moving for a jury trial, they should have been given notice immediately by my lawyer or the federal court that that information had to come down until this case was over. Now, why? Because what that forced me to do is take a lowball settlement offer to get away from this external pain, only to find out later on that I didn't even need to settle because the damage was already done. So I got harmed twice. Now, here comes the third harm. After settlement, I lost my practice because everyone sees that. And I've got 4 referenceable projects that were not given to me specifically because of what they saw on the internet. They actually said that. We read that, okay? So I'm taking my situation and I'm saying, if I were to bring this to a committee that was formed, let's say this new regulatory body would be called SID, Stop Information Defamation, I would say, this is my situation, this is how I think the regulation should be put in place so as others don't get harmed the way I did. Because mine's in the can, so to speak, already. Nothing's gonna change that. Damage is done. I've already been hurt. What I'm trying to do is stop that from happening to others that get into a legal situation, right? And like I said, if there's others of you out there that are in business and this happened because they allowed your competitor, well, then you would bring your situation in and help provide the type of regulation that needs to be put in place to stop that. And that's all this video is about. It's my situation. Why? Because to know what actually happened says how we need regulation. So we really need to get SID going, and I really need everyone to start jumping on that GoFundMe, because we got to get some of these conferences going.